From Walden, or Life in the Woods. From Economy. When I wrote the following pages, or rather the bulk of them, I lived alone in the woods, a mile from any neighbor, in a house which I had built myself on the shore of Walden Pond in Concord, Massachusetts, and earned my living by the labor of my hands only. I lived there 2 years and 2 months. At present, I am a sojourner in civilized life again. I should not obtrude my affairs so much on the notice of my readers if very particular inquiries had not been made by my townsmen concerning my mode of life, which some would call impertinent, though they do not appear to call me to me at all impertinent, but considering the circumstances, very natural and pertinent. Some have asked what I got to eat. Did I not feel lonesome? If I was not afraid, and the like. Others have been curious to learn what portions of my income I devoted to charitable purposes. And some, who have large families, how many poor children I maintained. I will therefore ask those of my readers who feel no particular interest in me to pardon me if I undertake to answer some of these questions in this book. In most books, the I, or first person, is omitted. In this, it is retained. That in respect to egotism is the main difference. We commonly do not remember that it is, after all, always the first person that is speaking. I should not talk so much about myself if there were anybody else whom I knew as well. Unfortunately, I am confined to this theme by the narrows of my experience. Moreover, I, on my side, require of every writer, first or last, a simple and sincere account of his own life, and not merely what he has heard of other men's lives. Some such account as he would send to his kindred from a distant land. For if he had lived, certainly it must have been in a distant land to me. Perhaps these pages are more particularly addressed to poor students. As for the rest of my readers, they will accept such portions as apply to them. I trust that none will stretch the seams in putting on the coat, for it may do good service to him who it fits. By the middle of April, for I made no haste in my work, but rather made the most of it, my house was framed and ready for the raising. I had already bought the shanty of James Collins, an Irishman who worked on the Fitchburg Railroad for boards. James Collins' shanty was considered as an uncommonly fine one. When I called to see it, he was not at home. I walked about the outside, at first unobserved from within. The window was so deep and high. It was of small dimensions, with a peaked cottage roof, and not much else to be seen, the dirt being raised 5 feet all around, as if it were a compost heap. The roof was the soundest part, though a good deal warped and made brittle by the sun. Door sill there was none, but a perennial passage for the hens under the door board. Mrs. C. came to the door and asked me to view it from the inside. The hens were driven in by my approach. It was dark and had a dirt floor for the most part, dank, clammy, and aguish. Only here a board and there a board which would not bear removal. She lighted a lamp to show me the inside of the roof and walls, and also that the board floor extended under the bed, warning me not to step into the cellar, a sort of dust hole 2 feet deep. In her own words, they were good boards overhead, good boards all around, and a good window. Of 2 whole squares originally, only the cat had passed out that way lately. There was a stove, a bed, and a place to sit an infant in the house where it was born. A silk parasol, gilt framed looking glass, and a patent new coffee mill nailed to an oak sapling, all told. The bargain was soon concluded, for James had in the meanwhile returned. I to pay $4.25 tonight. He to vacate at 5 tomorrow morning, selling to nobody else meanwhile. I to take possession at 6. It were well, he said, to be there early and anticipate certain indistinct but wholly unjust claims on the score of ground, rent, and fuel. This, he assured me, was the only incumbents. At 6, I passed him and his family on the road. One large bundle held their all: bed, coffee mill, looking glass, hens, all but the cat. She took to the woods and became a wild cat. And, as I learned afterward, trod in a trap set for woodchucks, and so became a dead cat at last. I took down this dwelling the same morning, drawing the nails, and removed it to the pond side by small cartloads, spreading the boards on the grass where the bleach and warp where grass there to bleach and warp back again in the sun. One early thrush, that's a bird, gave me a note or two as I drove along the woodland path. I was informed treacherously by a young Patrick that neighbor Seeley, an Irishman, in the intervals of the carting, transferred the still tolerable straight and drivable nails, staples, and spikes to his pocket, and then stood when I came back to pass the time of day, and looked freshly up, unconcerned with spring thoughts at the devastation. There being a dearth of work, as he said, he was there to represent spectatordom and help make this seemingly insignificant event one with the removal of the gods of Troy. I dug my cellar in the side of the hill sloping the south, where a woodchuck had formerly dug his burrow, down through sumac and blackberry roots, and the lowest stain of vegetation, 6 feet square by 7 deep, to a fine sand where potatoes would not freeze in any winter. The sides were shelving and not stoned, but the sun having never shone on them, the sand still keeps its place. But it was 2 hours' work. I took particular pleasure in this breaking of ground, for in almost all latitudes men dig into the earth for an equitable temperature. Under the most splendid house in the city is still to be found the cellar, where they store their roots as of old. And long after the superstructure has disappeared, prosperity remark its dent to the earth. The house is still but a sort of porch at the entrance of the burrow. At length, in the beginning of May, with the help of some acquaintances, rather to improve so good an occasion for neighborliness than from necessity, I set up the frame of my house. No man was ever more honored in the character of his raisers than I. They are destined, I trust, to assist at the raising of loftier structures one day. I began to occupy my house on the 4th of July, as soon as it was boarded and roofed, for the boards were carefully feathered and lapped, so that it was perfectly impervious to rain. But before boarding, I laid the foundation of a chimney at one end, bringing 2 cartloads of stones up from the hill from the pond in my arms. I built the chimney after my hoeing in the fall, before a fire became necessary for warmth, doing my cooking in doing my cooking while outdoors on the ground early in the morning, which mode I still think is in some respects more convenient and agreeable than the usual one. When it stormed before my bread was baked, I fixed a few boards over the fire and sat under them to watch my loaf and passed some pleasant hours in that way. In those days, when my hands were much employed, I read but little. But the least scraps of paper which lay on the ground, my holder or tablecloth, aforementioned, afforded me as much entertainment, in fact, answered the same purpose as the Iliad. It would be worth the while to build still more deliberately than I did, considering, for instance, what foundation a door, a window, a cellar, a garret have in the nature of man, and perchance never raising any superstructure until we found a better reason for it than our temporal necessities. There is some of the same fitness in a man's building his own house than that there is in a bird's building its own nest. Who knows but if men constructed their dwellings with their own hands and provided food for themselves and families simply and honestly enough, the poetic faculty would be universally developed, as birds universally sing when they are so engaged. But alas, we do like cowbirds and cuckoos, which lay their eggs in nests which other birds have built, and cheer no traveler with their chattering and unmusical notes. Shall we forever resign the pleasure of construction to the carpenter? What does the architecture amount to in the experience of the mass of men? I never, in all my walks, came across a man engaged in so simple and nature an occupation as building his house. Before winter, I built a chimney and shingled the side of my house, which were already impervious to rain, with imperfect and sappy shingles made of the first slice of the log, whose edge I was obliged to straighten with a plane. I have thus a tight shingled and plastered house, 10 feet wide by 15 long, an 8-foot post with a garret and a closet, a large window on each side, 2 trapdoors, one at the end, and a brick fireplace opposite. The exact cost of my house, paying the usual price for such materials as I used, but not counting the work, all of which I had done myself, was as follows, and I give the details because very few are able to tell exactly what their houses cost, and fewer still, if any, the separate cost of the various materials which compose them. Before I finished my house, wishing to earn $10 or $12 by some honest and agreeable method in order to meet my unusual expenses, I planted about 2.5 acres of light and sandy soil near it, chiefly with beans, but also a small part with potatoes, corn, peas, and turnips. The whole lot contains 11 acres, mostly growing up to pines and hickories, and was sold the preceding season for $8.08 an acre. One farmer said that it was good for nothing but to raise sheep and squirrels on. I put no manure whatever on this land, not being the owner, but merely a squatter, and not expecting to cultivate so much again, and I did not quite hoe it all one. I got out several cords of stumps in plowing, which supplied me with fuel for a long time, and left small circles of virgin mold easily distinguishable through the summer by the great luxuries of the beans there. The dead and for the most part merchantable wood behind my house and the driftwood from the pond, I have supplied the remainder of my fuel. I was obliged to hire a team and a man for the plowing, though I held the plow myself. My farm outgrows for the first season were for implements, seeds, work, etc. $14.72.5. The seed corn was given me. This never costs anything to speak of unless you plant more than enough. I got 12 bushels of beans and 18 bushels of potatoes, besides some peas and sweet corn. The yellow corn and turnips were too late to come to anything. My whole income from the farm was, beside produce consumed and on hand at the time this estimate was made, of the value of $4.50. The amount on hand, which more than balancing a little grass, which I did not raise. All things considered, that is, considering the importance of a man's soul and of today, notwithstanding the short time occupied by my experiment, nay, partly even because of its transient character, I believe that was doing better than any farmer in Concord did that year.